The undisputed ruler of 1,000,000,000,000 souls was choking on her own silver blood, and the only cure in the galaxy was currently rotting in a detention cell 3 miles beneath her throne. Empress Valia, sovereign of the Draconic Empire, sat upon the towering ruby throne. Her scales shimmered like polished obsidian beneath the immense crystalline chandeliers of the Grand Galactic Summit. Ambassadors from 100 star systems knelt on the pristine white marble floor, offering tribute and seeking favor. Valia ruled with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove, her mind sharp and her body practically immortal by the standards of lesser species. Then, her breath hitched. A violent spasm seized her spine. Valia pitched forward, her crown clattering against the dais. She tumbled down the polished obsidian steps, her majestic form convulsing. Dark, silver-laced blood erupted from her lips, pooling on the floor. The flesh along her jawline and neck, normally impervious to direct energy blasts, began to dissolve into a terrifying ashen-gray necrosis. The sound of her hardened scales cracking and flaking away echoed in the sudden, horrifying silence of the great hall. Panic consumed the summit. High Minister Vane, a towering draconic noble with eyes like chips of flint and a heart of pure ambition, immediately seized the central podium. He shouted for order, declaring the collapse an assassination by a cowardly biological attack, ordering a total planetary lockdown. Internally, Vane was coldly observing the absolute success of his engineered phage. This poison was a masterpiece of dark science, designed specifically to bypass the flawless draconic immune system, a feat the entire galaxy considered scientifically impossible. Someone had unlocked a very dark, very buried piece of biological data to create this weapon, and Vane was already orchestrating the next phase of his grand design. Deep in the subterranean bowels of the palace, 3 miles beneath the chaos, Kalen was completely unaware of the dying Empress. He sat on a cold plasteel bench in a holding cell, a human smuggler caught with undeclared thermal coils in a sector where humanity was barely tolerated. To the draconic elite, humans were a primitive, messy, and remarkably fragile species, fit only for manual labor in the outer rim or serving as target practice for bored aristocrats. Kalen leaned his head against the damp, vibrating wall of the detention block. He was calculating the exact bribe he would need to slide across a desk to get his impounded freighter back. He had a tight schedule to keep and a very impatient, very heavily armed buyer waiting on the edge of the contested zones. He rubbed his wrists, thinking about the sheer arrogance of the draconic magistrates who had locked him up without a glance. Suddenly, the heavy detention block door slammed open, ripping Kalen from his thoughts. A squad of elite draconic enforcers marched in, their heavy armor gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. They were not here to collect fines or process paperwork. Under High Minister Vane's direct and immediate orders, a swift, brutal purge of the lower levels had begun. Vane needed a scapegoat to present to the public for the Empress's murder, and a disorganized band of human smugglers rotting in the dungeon fit his narrative perfectly. Rough, gauntleted hands hauled Kalen to his feet, binding his wrists with high-tension magnetic cuffs. He tried to ask what the charge was, but a blow to the ribs silenced him. He was dragged down the narrow, dripping corridor along with a dozen other confused, terrified prisoners. They were shoved into the high-speed, heavy-duty cargo elevators that led directly to the upper execution courtyards. The elevator ride was a blur of rising tension and the distinct smell of ozone from charged weapons. When the massive metal doors finally parted to reveal the night sky of Draconis Prime, Kalen realized he was walking into a war zone. In the center of the expansive courtyard, Commander Silas, the fiercely loyal and battle-scarred head of the Royal Guard, was fighting a desperate, losing battle. He and his surviving men were trying to drag the comatose, rapidly decaying body of Empress Valia toward a heavily armored medical transport ship resting on the landing pad. But Vane had anticipated this exact maneuver. A dozen masked assassins, draped in optical camouflage cloaks, had descended from the upper parapets. They were laying down a merciless, highly coordinated barrage of plasma fire, pinning the royal guard behind shattered statues and decorative fountains. Kalen and the other prisoners were pushed forcefully out of the elevator right into the crossfire. The enforcers holding them were cut down in the very first volley of superheated plasma. Kalen hit the deck hard, his street-honed survival instincts taking over. He rolled frantically behind a shattered stone pillar as a bolt of blue plasma scorched the air where his head had just been, melting the stone behind him into slag. He noticed the magnetic locks on his cuffs had been severely damaged by the intense heat of the near miss. With a sharp, agonizing twist of his wrists and a grunt of pure exertion, he snapped the bindings. He was free, but he was trapped in an open courtyard with trained killers. He needed a ship. The Royal Medical Transport, with its heavy armor plating and pre-warmed engines, looked like his only ticket off this rock. Kalen scrambled across the courtyard, diving from cover to cover, keeping his head down as chunks of masonry exploded around him. He was 10 feet from the transport's lowered loading ramp when Silas and 2 exhausted guards shoved the hover stretcher carrying the dying Empress into the open. It was a desperate push for the ramp. At that exact second, an assassin dropped from a stealth glider directly above them, landing with heavy boots on the ramp itself, aiming a kinetic heavy repeater squarely at Valia's chest. Kalen did not think about the politics of the Empire. He did not think about his profound distaste for the royals. He just moved. He lunged forward, tackling the armored assassin at the waist just as the heavy weapon discharged. The assassin stumbled, the barrel of the gun jerking wildly. A stray kinetic round ripped through the air, tearing right across Kalen's shoulder. The pain was immediate, a blinding flash of white-hot agony. Blood bright crimson, profoundly human blood, sprayed outward from the wound in a wide arc. The crimson spray splashed directly across Empress Valia's exposed throat and chest, landing squarely onto the festering gray, necrotic wounds that were rapidly eating away at her majestic scales. What happened next brought the entire chaotic firefight to a dead, stunned halt. The very moment Kalen's human blood made contact with Valia's dying flesh. A violent, audible hiss filled the air, cutting through the ringing of gunfire. The gray rot stopped spreading instantly, before the astonished, disbelieving eyes of Commander Silas and the surrounding assassins. The necrotic tissue began to stitch itself back together at a biologically impossible speed. The silver blood bubbling from the Empress's lips ceased completely. Her obsidian scales reformed, knitting together and gleaming once again with renewed, vibrant vitality. Valia drew a massive, shuddering breath, her chest rising and falling. The medical monitors on the hover stretcher, which had been blaring a flat-line warning, suddenly chimed with strong, stabilized vitals. Kalen hit the deck, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He stared up at the draconic ruler, watching the color return to her face. He had absolutely no idea how a smuggler's blood had just cured a genetically engineered, supposedly infallible supervirus. But as the masked assassins slowly recovered from their shock and turned their heavy weapons away from the Empress and directly toward him, Kalen realized his life was about to get infinitely more complicated. Commander Silas had spent a century mastering the art of war, but his greatest tactical advantage was suddenly a bleeding human smuggler. The courtyard was frozen in absolute disbelief for a fraction of a second. But that was all the veteran guard needed. Recognizing the impossible miracle that had just occurred on the landing pad, Silas made a split-second decision. The heavily armored medical transport was a giant, glowing target, and the sky above was already swarming with High Minister Vane's loyalist gunships. They could not go up into the crosshairs. They had to go down into the dark. Silas slammed his armored fist onto a hidden biometric panel concealed beneath the rim of a decorative fountain. The marble floor directly beneath the hover stretcher and Kalen dissolved into a steep, spiraling chute. The three of them plunged into the darkness, leaving the furious plasma fire of the assassins echoing above. They slid down the smooth, lightless tunnel for what felt like miles, the air growing instantly cooler and thick with the scent of ancient dust. They were unceremoniously dumped onto the cracked stone floor of the forgotten catacombs, a sprawling subterranean labyrinth built by the very first draconic emperors and sealed away for millennia. Kalen hit the ground hard, his injured shoulder screaming in protest. He rolled to his feet, instantly pressing his back against a massive, crumbling stone pillar, his eyes darting through the gloom. The faint bioluminescent moss clinging to the cavernous ceiling cast an eerie green glow over towering statues of winged conquerors. He was trapped. He had escaped the execution block only to become the personal prisoner of the Empire's most wanted fugitives. Silas was already on his feet, his plasma rifle sweeping the shadows, placing himself firmly between the human and the unconscious Empress. Kalen pressed a hand to his bleeding shoulder, wincing, but his mind was already calculating the angles. He was a survivor, and he knew a golden ticket when he saw one. He looked at the commander and laid out his terms with absolute, unwavering confidence. He pointed out that whatever highly illegal, unmapped poison had been melting the royal scales, his completely ordinary lower-tier human blood had stopped it cold. Kalen demanded his freedom. He demanded his impounded freighter fully refueled and his cargo returned. If the Empire wanted his plasma, they were going to have to pay the smuggler's premium. Before Silas could formulate a suitably threatening response to this sheer audacity, a sharp, ragged cough echoed through the cavern. Empress Valia opened her eyes. The terrifying gray rot was completely gone, replaced by flawless, gleaming obsidian scales. Though she looked utterly exhausted, she slowly pushed herself up from the hover stretcher, her regal bearing returning almost instantly despite the grim surroundings. She demanded a situational report from her commander, her voice carrying the absolute authority of the Ruby Throne. Silas dropped to one knee, explaining the ambush, the descent into the catacombs, and, with obvious reluctance, the method of her miraculous recovery. He gestured toward Kalen, who gave a mockingly polite two-finger salute. The cultural collision was immediate and spectacular. Valia stared at Kalen with a mixture of profound shock and deep, aristocratic revulsion. For her entire life, she had been taught that humanity was a chaotic, unrefined species, barely capable of managing their own polluted colonies, let alone interacting with draconic nobility. To learn that her divine biology had been saved by the biological fluid of a sarcastic cargo hauler was a devastating blow to her imperial pride. She immediately ordered Kalen to avert his eyes and address her by her full sequence of royal titles. Kalen simply ripped a strip of cloth from his tunic, tied a makeshift tourniquet around his arm, and informed her that titles meant absolutely nothing in a damp basement with assassins overhead. He told her she was currently a target, just like him, and unless her crown doubled as a plasma shield, she needed to drop the attitude and start walking. Valia was furious. No one had ever spoken to her with such blatant disrespect, yet she possessed a sharp, tactical mind. She recognized the truth in his harsh words. The lower levels of the capital were alien to her, a terrifying underbelly she had only ever seen as a glowing grid on a strategic holomap. She needed Kalen's street-smart pragmatism to survive the next few hours, even if his casual demeanor made her want to throw him out an airlock. Silas interrupted the brewing argument, pointing his rifle down a dark corridor. A faint mechanical whirring sound echoed off the stone walls. Emerging from the shadows was a rusted, heavily modified sanctuary droid. It was a relic from the old empire, its chassis scored with centuries of neglect, but its central medical scanner still pulsed with a faint blue light. Silas recognized the ancient sigils on its casing. This sector of the catacombs was once a triage center during the Unification Wars. The droid hummed as it approached, its optical sensors locking onto the blood dripping from Kalen's shoulder and the residual traces on Vylia's skin. It extended a delicate, trembling sampling needle. Kalen instinctively recoiled, but Valia ordered him to submit, her curiosity overcoming her disgust. She needed to know exactly how a human had countered a weapon that had defeated the finest draconic scientists. The droid sampled the blood, its internal processors grinding as it cross-referenced a database that had not been updated in 1,000 years. A holographic projection flickered to life in the dusty air between them, displaying a highly magnified view of Kalen's cellular structure. The image was astonishing. Floating among the standard red and white human blood cells were microscopic, highly complex synthetic structures. They were dormant until they encountered the specific foreign protein strain of the draconic phage. The droid's synthesized voice echoed through the cavern, delivering a profound historical revelation. These were not natural antibodies. They were inherited, military-grade nanites. Centuries ago, during Earth's catastrophic near-extinction biological wars, humanity had engineered these microscopic defenders to combat highly mutating viral weapons. The nanites had integrated perfectly into human DNA, passing down through generations, effectively making modern humanity immune to a vast array of synthetic pathogens. The draconic phage, designed by Vane to be hyper-aggressive, had triggered this ancient human defense mechanism, and the nanites had utterly annihilated the poison. Kalen stared at his own arm, realizing that the chaotic, violent history of his homeworld was currently flowing through his veins. Serving as the perfect, unintended cure for an alien empire's political assassination, Valia gazed at the glowing hologram, the foundational beliefs of her entire worldview fracturing. The primitive species her empire had marginalized possessed an evolutionary defense mechanism far superior to anything in the draconic armada. But a much darker question immediately took root in her mind. If this human nanite strain was an ancient, forgotten piece of Earth's history, how did High Minister Vane know exactly how to engineer a phage that perfectly triggered it? Somewhere in the dark, intricate web of Vane's conspiracy, there was a deeply hidden connection to humanity, and Valia knew they had to uncover it before the minister realized his ultimate weapon had a terrifyingly common antidote. The greatest betrayal in the history of the Draconic Empire was not locked inside a heavily guarded vault, but buried in the cache memory of a rusted medical droid. The ancient machine, attempting to update its millennial-old databanks to properly analyze the human blood sample, blindly reached out to the palace's modern subnet. It bypassed the primary security firewall simply by being too obsolete to register as a credible threat. Instead of pulling updated medical journals, the droid accidentally intercepted and downloaded a highly encrypted packet of recently purged comm logs. The holographic projector flickered, replacing the magnified image of human nanites with the imposing angular face of High Minister Vane. Vane was speaking in hushed, urgent tones to a shadowy figure bathed in the blue light of a deep space transmission. They were discussing the absolute success of the Earth strain integration. Valia and Kalen listened in stunned silence as the minister outlined exactly how he had used stolen black market human biological data to engineer the phage. It was designed specifically to exploit a microscopic blind spot in draconic genetics while remaining completely untraceable by standard imperial tech. The end goal of this dark science was laid bare: assassinate the Empress. Frame the human underclass to ignite a populist frenzy of xenophobia, and use emergency wartime powers to seize absolute, unquestioned control of the formidable draconic armada. Valia watched her most trusted advisor coldly detail the logistics of her murder. Her obsidian scales flushed with radiant heat, a physical manifestation of her mounting fury. She stepped forward, commanding Silas to establish a secure priority link to the Armada High Command immediately. She intended to broadcast this intercepted log and order Vane's public execution. Before Silas could even reach for his wristcom, the heavy stone ceiling high above them shuddered violently. Dust rained down in thick, choking sheets. The unmistakable rhythmic thud of magnetic breaching charges echoed down the ancient spiral chute they had used to escape. Vane's elite tracker units, the dreaded obsidian hounds, had found their trail. Valia stood tall, wiping a smear of ancient dust from her cheek. She declared she would meet the assassins head-on, announce her survival, and strip Vane of his rank by the divine right of the Ruby Throne. Kaelin immediately grabbed her arm, roughly pulling her back behind the crumbling statue of a forgotten emperor. He sharply pointed out that Vane already controlled the narrative on the surface. To the heavily armed soldiers dropping into this basement, Valia was already a casualty of human terrorism. Anything that looked like her walking out of the shadows would be written off as a human trick or an illegal clone. Stepping out into the open meant taking a concentrated volley of plasma straight to the chest. For the first time in her long, exalted life, the Empress of 1,000,000,000 souls realized her absolute authority was entirely useless. She was a ghost in her own palace. The heavy thud of armored boots hitting the stone floor resonated through the cavern. The hounds were spreading out, their advanced thermal optics sweeping the gloom, hunting for body heat. Silas readies his heavy rifle, stepping into the choke point of the corridor, preparing to sell his life dearly in a final, glorious stand to buy his sovereign time. Kaelin rolled his eyes at the display of suicidal draconic honor. He told them both to keep their heads down and leave the dirty work to a professional scavenger. Moving with practiced, silent speed, the human smuggler began stripping the ancient sanctuary droid of its heavy power cells and heavy-duty plasma welders. He quickly raided Silas's combat webbing for a handful of standard-issue fragmentation grenades, completely ignoring the commander's outraged protests over the theft of Imperial property. Kaelin used a spool of high-tensile towing wire from his own belt to rig a brutal, highly unorthodox series of traps. Draconic military doctrine relied on overwhelming force, superior armor, and advanced targeting algorithms. They never trained to look for low-tech kinetic tripwires strung at ankle height in the dark. The first squad of obsidian hounds advanced down the central corridor, their weapons raised and locked. The lead soldier snapped the invisible wire. The tension released a heavy stone block from the vaulted ceiling, which plummets directly onto the makeshift explosive array Kaelin had cobbled together. The resulting blast did not just shred the advancing squad, it vaporizes the structural supports of the corridor itself, bringing tons of ancient rock crashing down and entirely sealing the main route in a deafening avalanche of stone and fire. The sheer chaotic ingenuity of the trap left Silas completely speechless. Valia watched Kaelin with a new, heavily guarded respect. He was not a warrior by her aristocratic standards, but he was undeniably a survivor, wielding the unpredictable chaos of humanity as a highly effective weapon. Kaelin did not waste time gloating over the collapsed tunnel. He pointed toward a rusted, heavily reinforced grating set into the floor at the very back of the sanctuary. It was an industrial runoff vent, leading straight down into the planetary exhaust systems. It was their only way out before the surviving hounds blasted their way through the rubble. Prying the heavy grate aside required the combined, desperate strength of Silas and Valia. A wave of hot, chemical-laced air washed over them immediately. It smelled strongly of sulfur, synthesized engine fuel, and unwashed bodies. It was the undeniable stench of the lower levels. Valia hesitated at the edge of the pit. The descent into the vent meant leaving the last remnants of her royal domain, the clean, orderly history of her ancestors, and plunging into the hyper-industrial neon-lit underbelly of Draconis Prime. It was a sector entirely ruled by violent crime syndicates, ruthless black marketeers, and the desperately poor. It was a place the Ruby Throne actively pretended did not exist. Kaelin dropped into the dark shaft first, calling up from the gloom that the hospitality down here was terrible, but the street food was surprisingly good if you did not ask what was in it. Silas followed, his rifle raised to secure the perimeter below. Velia took one last look at the pristine, crumbling statues of her grandfathers, took a deep breath of the toxic air, and slid down into the dark. They emerged from the rusted piping into a sprawling nightmare of sound and color. The vent deposited them onto a narrow, swaying catwalk suspended high above a massive canyon of rusted metal and glowing neon signage. Gigantic atmospheric exhaust turbines roared continuously in the distance, shaking the very air in their lungs. Millions of beings, humans, disenfranchised alien species, and disgraced draconic outcasts, swarmed through the narrow, crowded streets far below. The entire sector was violently illuminated by the harsh, flickering glare of massive holographic advertisements pushing cheap synthetic liquor and highly illegal cybernetics. The Empress was momentarily paralyzed by the sheer, crushing sensory overload. She had spent her entire life in perfectly climate-controlled halls, surrounded by silence, pristine beauty, and absolute deference. Here, the noise was a heavy physical weight, and the brutal reality of the lower classes was laid bare in every grime-covered face and crumbling, overcrowded hab block. She saw draconic citizens, her own people, shivering in rags next to humming power conduits, begging for scraps alongside the humans she had always been told were lesser beings. Kaelin snapped her out of her shock, throwing a heavy, oil-stained canvas cloak over her shoulders and roughly pulling the hood up to conceal her highly recognizable obsidian scales. He warned her in a harsh whisper to keep her head down, her back straight, and her mouth completely shut. In Sector 4, a pristine draconic noble was worth a fortune in ransom to the local warlords, and a dead one was worth even more to the political extremists. As they moved off the catwalk and blended into the chaotic, surging crowds of the market district, a massive holographic projection crackled to life on the side of a towering cooling spire directly above them. It was the face of High Minister Vane, magnified to the size of a dreadnought. He looked appropriately sorrowful as his amplified voice boomed across the slums. He formally announced the tragic assassination of the Empress by a radical, highly organized human terror cell. He immediately declared a planetary state of total martial law, suspended all basic citizen rights, and announced his temporary, emergency ascension to the role of Supreme Commander of the Armada. Velia glared up at the towering projection of the man who had murdered her, surrounded by the crushing poverty her own empire had intentionally created by ignoring these depths. The tightness in her chest was no longer just about personal betrayal. It was about a profoundly broken system that allowed a monster to thrive while her people starved in the dark. As Kaelin led them deeper into the neon maze toward a contact he swore could get them off-world, Velia realized the only way to truly reclaim her throne was to tear the old empire down by the roots and start over. But Vane currently had the most destructive military force in the galaxy at his fingertips. And his first target was a world that had absolutely no idea it was about to be annihilated. Sector 4 was not a place you visited. It was a meat grinder you merely survived if you had the right credits or the right gun. For the Empress of 1,000,000,000 souls, it was a terrifying crash course in the brutal reality her pristine throne had actively ignored. Kaelin led them through the labyrinth of rusted catwalks and dripping chemical pipes, forcing Velia into a narrow alcove to affix a stolen, heavily modified cloaking dampener to her collar. The device hummed violently against her collarbone, projecting a localized optical distortion field that dulled her magnificent obsidian scales to a sickly, unremarkable slate gray. To the passing denizens of the Undercity, she no longer looked like royalty, She looked like just another terminally ill refinery worker coughing up industrial smog. The deeper they descended, the thicker the toxic haze became, clinging to their clothes and burning their lungs. Valia walked in stunned silence. She saw draconic veterans with missing limbs begging for synthetic water rations. She saw human children sleeping on active exhaust vents just to stay warm. Every shadowy corner held a desperate transaction or a quiet tragedy. The majestic, unified empire she believed she ruled was a complete fabrication. A gilded cage resting entirely on the crushed spines of these forgotten millions. Silas marched rigidly beside her, his hand never leaving the grip of his concealed rifle, deeply disgusted by the squalor but sworn to protect his sovereign regardless of the environment. Kalen moved with an easy, fluid grace through the crushing crowds, entirely in his element. He guided them toward the black market exchange, a sprawling subterranean bazaar built inside the hollowed-out carcass of a decommissioned orbital dreadnought. He needed to leverage his underground contacts to secure safe passage to the outer rim, and he knew a network of smugglers and information brokers who absolutely despised the draconic elite. He bypassed the main entrance, leading them through a heavily guarded loading bay into a dimly lit, smoke-filled cantina run by a massive, scarred alien known only as Jax. Jax held no love for the Empire, but he loved untraceable currency. Kalen casually tossed a heavy, solid gold royal signet ring onto the scarred metal bar. He had subtly lifted it from Silas's utility belt during the elevator ride, a fact that made the loyal commander instantly reach for his weapon. Kalen waved Silas down, holding Jax's gaze. He demanded immediate transport off-world. No questions asked, no cargo manifests filed. Jax inspected the ring, a greedy glint in his 4 eyes, and nodded slowly, sliding the payment into his vest. He turned to a rusted comm console to arrange the extraction, but the deal was cut violently short. The heavy blast doors of the cantina blew inward with a deafening concussive wave, sending metal shrapnel and shattered glass tearing through the crowded room. A heavily armed execution squad from the local Crimson Syndicate poured through the smoke. High Minister Vane had not just relied on his own troops. He had broadcast a massive, open-channel bounty to every criminal enterprise in Sector 4 for the capture of the human terrorists. The Syndicate thugs, eager to claim a reward that could buy them their own moon, immediately locked their targeting lasers onto Kalen. The cantina erupted into absolute chaos. Patrons scrambled for the exits as the Syndicate opened fire, tearing the bar to pieces with heavy kinetic rounds. Kalen did not hesitate. He kicked a heavy metal table upward, providing a split-second barricade, and fired a localized EMP disruptor from his wrist console directly into the ceiling's lighting grid. The cantina plunged into pitch darkness, illuminated only by the frantic, strobing flashes of weapon fire. Valia could have cowered behind Silas. She could have frozen in the face of this lawless, unrefined violence. Instead, centuries of intensive royal combat training took over. She snatched a discarded shock baton from the floor, the weapon activating with a lethal crackling surge of energy, as a hulking Syndicate enforcer lunged over their makeshift barricade in the dark. Valia stepped perfectly inside his guard. With a fluid, devastatingly precise motion, she drove the baton into the vulnerable joint of his armor, sending millions of volts through his nervous system and dropping him instantly. Kalen watched her move through the strobe-lit chaos, genuinely impressed. He laid down a suppressive barrage of plasma fire, covering her blind spots as she methodically dismantled 2 more attackers with terrifying efficiency. They fought side by side, a perfectly synchronized dance of human street tactics and draconic martial perfection. When the last Syndicate thug fled back through the smoking doorway, the cantina was completely silent save for the groaning of stressed metal. Kalen looked at the Empress, her chest heaving, the shock baton still humming in her grip. He realized she was not just a figurehead sitting on a velvet cushion. She was a hardened warrior who carried the actual physical burden of leadership, willing to bloody her own hands to survive. Conversely, Valia looked at the human smuggler, recognizing that his cynical, chaotic methods were not the flailings of a primitive mind, but the highly evolved survival skills of a man forced to outsmart a universe that constantly wanted him dead. Knowing the syndicate would return with reinforcements, they abandoned the cantina, slipping deeper into the maintenance tunnels beneath the bazaar. They finally found temporary refuge in an abandoned, echoing aqueduct control room, miles away from the bounty hunters. The adrenaline crash hit them hard. Silas immediately took up a defensive position at the only reinforced door, his eyes scanning the security feeds on a rusted monitor. Kalen slumped against the damp stone wall, sliding down to the floor with an exhausted sigh. He reached into his coat and produced 2 foil-wrapped packages he had swiped from a street vendor cart during their initial descent. He tossed one to Valia. It was a steaming portion of synthesized protein noodles, heavily spiced and utterly unrefined. Valia caught the package, looking at it with a mixture of hunger and deep suspicion. She sat down opposite him on an overturned crate, pulling back the foil. She took a cautious bite, expecting industrial waste, but found it surprisingly savory, a harsh but comforting warmth against the damp chill of the tunnel. As they ate in the dim emergency lighting, the icy wall between them began to thaw. Kalen spoke openly about his life in the outer rim, the constant running, the perpetual struggle to find fuel and food while dodging imperial taxation fleets that treated humans like stray vermin. He described the beauty of the lawless frontiers, the freedom of the Black Void, and the tight-knit loyalty of his scavenger crew. Valia listened, truly listened, for the first time in her reign. In turn, she spoke of the Ruby Throne. She described the crushing, suffocating isolation of power, the endless parade of sycophants, and the terrifying knowledge that a single political misstep could plunge 1 trillion lives into civil war. She confessed the profound loneliness of being elevated above all others, surrounded by guards but entirely without friends. The flickering light cast soft shadows across their faces. The shared meal of cheap street food achieved what 100 diplomatic galas never could. A simmering, reluctant romantic tension began to take root in the damp, quiet space between them. They were no longer a human smuggler and a draconic empress. They were just 2 exhausted survivors sharing the weight of a hostile galaxy. But the brief moment of connection was fragile, and the relentless machinery of Vane's conspiracy was already closing in on their hidden sanctuary, forcing them to seek out the one place humanity truly called home on this unforgiving planet. 3 miles beneath the glittering capital, humanity did not just survive the crushing dark. They thrived in the microscopic cracks of the Draconic Empire's colossal foundation. Kalen guided Empress Valia and Commander Silas past the roaring aqueducts and into the solid, unmapped bedrock of the planetary crust. They navigated a series of treacherous, forgotten mining fissures until they reached a massive, rusted blast door entirely overgrown with bioluminescent fungi. Kalen pressed his palm against a concealed scanner, and the heavy metal parted with a heavy, grinding groan. Warm, golden light flooded the damp tunnel, accompanied by the chaotic, beautiful sounds of life. They stepped into the drift, a sprawling subterranean sanctuary pieced together from the hollowed-out husks of ancient cargo haulers and scavenged terraforming equipment. To Valia, it was a profound revelation. The air here was not choked with toxic refinery smog, but smelled faintly of ozone, roasted root vegetables, and human sweat. String lights powered by jury-rigged thermal batteries illuminated a bustling, multi-level shanty town. Children chased each other across suspended cargo nets, while heavily modified mechanics argued cheerfully over the sparking engine block of a smuggling skiff. There was a vibrant, undeniable warmth here that the sterile, polished halls of the imperial palace utterly lacked. Kalen walked through the crowded thoroughfare, and the transformation in his demeanor was instantaneous. The cynical, defensive shell he wore on the upper levels vanished. He exchanged rough embraces with scarred dock workers, tossed a stolen rationing chip to a group of cheering teenagers, and checked in on an elderly merchant tending a meager hydroponic garden. He was not just a lone scavenger, he was a vital artery for this hidden community, a provider who risked his life in the hostile skies to keep his people alive in the dark. Valia watched him from beneath her heavy canvas hood, her heart aching with a sudden, sharp clarity. She saw the genuine, unquestioning affection these outcasts held for him, and the fierce, protective loyalty he returned in equal measure. Silas stood rigidly by her side, his tactical mind struggling to process the sheer volume of unregulated civilians. But even the hardened draconic commander could not deny the impressive resourcefulness of the human settlement. Kalen led them into the belly of a grounded freighter that served as the Enclave's central hub. He introduced them to Corbo, a massive, cybernetically enhanced human engineer with a beard like steel wire, and Rhea, a brilliant young data slicer whose nervous system was directly hardwired into the Drift's central mainframe. Kalen did not reveal Valia's true identity, simply stating they were high-value targets carrying cargo that could bring the entire empire crashing down. He unlatched his wrist console and handed it to Rhea, instructing her to slice into the encrypted data cache he had mirrored from the ancient sanctuary droid. Rhea jacked the console into a massive bank of cooling towers, her fingers flying across a holographic interface. The central projection table flickered, painting the dimly lit room in a harsh, tactical blue light. The full, terrifying scope of High Minister Vane's grand design finally unspooled before their eyes. The intercepted logs were not merely detailing a localized coup. The blueprints floating above the table displayed the vast, automated bioforges of the draconic military entirely repurposed. Vane was mass-producing the Earth-strain phage, but he had aggressively weaponized the delivery system. The hologram showed thousands of long-range orbital torpedoes being loaded with a deadly biological agent. Vane intended to launch a massive, unprovoked preemptive strike against the neighboring Valari coalition and the Sylphid Ascendancy, two rival empires that bordered draconic space. Vane's logic, outlined in a chilled clinical audio recording, was devastatingly simple. By assassinating the Empress and blaming human terrorists, he secured absolute emergency wartime powers. With the Armada fully mobilized under his sole command, he would strike the rival empires before they could react to the internal political chaos. The phage would annihilate the Valari and Sylphid leadership, leaving their massive territories ripe for immediate draconic annexation. High Minister Vane was not just stealing a throne, he was actively initiating a galactic war of extermination that would cost billions of innocent lives. The silence in the freighter's command center was absolute. Valia stared at the rotating blue holograms, the sheer scale of the atrocity threatening to pull her under. She slowly reached up and pulled back her heavy canvas hood, deactivating the cloaking dampener. Her majestic obsidian scales rippled into view, catching the blue light of the hollow table. Corbo and Rhea gasped, instinctively taking a step back from the undisputed ruler of the galaxy standing in their rusted living room. Valia did not demand their deference. Instead, she leaned heavily against the command table, confronting the crushing moral failing of her own reign. For centuries, her empire had prioritized genetic purity, isolationism, and the rigid subjugation of any species deemed lesser. She had sat on the ruby throne, completely insulated from the suffering of her own citizens, believing her absolute power was a divine right rather than a profound responsibility. Her arrogance had created the exact shadows where a monster like Vane could cultivate his supreme power without scrutiny. The draconic elite were the actual primitives, blinding themselves with their own glittering reflections while the marginalized humans built genuine, enduring bonds in the dark. She looked at Kaelin, her golden eyes shining with unshed tears of absolute regret. She confessed that her empire did not deserve to survive if this was what it had become, a machine of endless, arrogant consumption. Kaelin stepped close to her, the romantic tension that had sparked in the aqueducts flaring into a profound mutual understanding. He reached out, his hand gently touching her armored shoulder, telling her that the empire could burn, but the people inside it could still be saved if she was willing to lead them from the ground up. Their moment of fragile peace was violently shattered. A massive, bone-rattling vibration tore through the cavern rock, shaking dust from the freighter's ceiling and sending loose tools clattering to the deck. The warm, golden ambient lighting of the drift flickered and instantly turned a harsh, blaring crimson. Rhea frantically manipulated the hollow table as a dozen proximity alarms began screaming in unison. Vane's forces had not stumbled upon them by accident. Rhea traced the incoming signal and realized the horrifying truth. The obsidian hounds were not tracking a visual signature or a thermal bloom. They had locked onto the highly unique, synthesized nanite frequency radiating from Kaelin's blood every single time his heart beat. The holographic display shifted, showing the subterranean fault line directly above the human enclave. It was completely swarming with heavily armored obsidian gunships. They had established a total impenetrable blockade of Sector 4. But the immediate threat was far worse. A deep penetrating comms laser pierced the bedrock, forcefully overriding the drift's localized audio system. High Minister Vane's cold, amplified voice echoed through the bustling shanty town, freezing every man, woman, and child in absolute terror. He announced he had located the human terrorist cell and the imposter mimicking their late Empress. Vane delivered his ultimatum with chilling precision. He gave the Enclave exactly 1 hour to surrender Kaelin and Valia to his elite strike teams. If the blast doors did not open, he would order the orbital dreadnoughts currently holding position in the upper atmosphere to initiate a localized, sustained crust fracture protocol. He would fire sustained kinetic bombardment directly into the planet's fault line, entirely collapsing the subterranean cavern and burying the human settlement under millions of tons of solid bedrock. The holographic timer materialized in the air above them, counting down from 60 minutes. The drift was completely trapped, vastly outgunned, and running out of time, leaving Valia with an impossible choice between saving the only species that had ever showed her true humanity, or sacrificing herself to a man who would burn the rest of the galaxy to ash. The red digital timer floating in the center of the subterranean command hub was not just counting down to an orbital strike. It was measuring the exact lifespan of Empress Valia's newfound conscience. 59 minutes remained before High Minister Vane cracked the planetary crust and buried the only genuine warmth she had ever experienced under 1 billion tons of rock. Valia stared at the glowing numerals, the ambient crimson light washing over her obsidian scales. She turned to look at the faces of the humans gathered in the rusted command center. Corbo gripped a heavy plasma wrench, his cybernetic eye whirring in distress. Rhea frantically tapped at her console, trying in vain to find a digital backdoor out of the blockade. Outside the freighter, the vibrant, chaotic sounds of the drift had been replaced by a suffocating, terrified silence. Children were crying. Mechanics were arming themselves with mining lasers. They were preparing to die for an alien ruler who had never given them a second thought until today. Valia straightened her spine, the ancient aristocratic conditioning asserting itself. But this time it was tempered by a profound, sacrificial grace. She ordered Commander Silas to stand down and remain with the human enclave. She declared her intention to walk out of the main airlock and surrender herself to the obsidian hounds. If her death satisfied Vane's immediate political theater, it might buy the drift enough time to scatter deeper into the mantle. It was the first truly selfless decree she had ever issued, a testament to the fact that her encounter with the lower tiers had fundamentally altered her soul. Silas dropped to one knee, rigidly refusing the order, begging her to let him lead a vanguard assault instead. But before Valia could reprimand her loyal commander, the heavy blast doors of the command hub slammed shut and magnetically sealed with a definitive clang. Kalen stood by the manual override panel, his hand resting on the lever, his face a mask of furious determination. He looked the Empress dead in the eye and flatly told her she was not going anywhere. Valia demanded he open the door, asserting her royal authority. But Kalen simply laughed, a harsh, cynical sound that cut through the tension. He pointed at the holographic projection of the blockading fleet above them. He explained the brutal mathematics of tyranny to her. Vane had engineered a biological superweapon, murdered royal guards, and planned to launch a preemptive galactic war. A man with that much blood on his ledger did not leave loose ends. If Valia surrendered, Vane would execute her on sight and then orbital bombard the drift anyway, permanently erasing the human cure and any witnesses to his treason. Walking out there was not a sacrifice. It was suicide. Kalen pushed past her and stepped up to the central comms terminal. He bypassed Ria's encrypted firewall and opened a wide-band public address frequency, patching his voice into every speaker, personal comlink, and rusted PA system throughout the subterranean shanty town. He did not offer them empty imperial platitudes or grand promises of a golden age. Kalen spoke to his people with the gritty, pragmatic truth of a scavenger who had spent a lifetime dodging crossfire. He told them the draconic armada was floating directly above their heads, holding the trigger on a weapon that would turn their home into a tomb. He acknowledged that they were outgunned, outmanned, and entirely out of time. But then, he pointed out a single glaring flaw in Vane's perfect trap. The High Minister expected them to cower in the dark like rats. He expected them to dig deeper. He never in a million years expected the rats to bite back. Kalen's voice echoed off the damp cavern walls, raw and electric. He reminded the humans, the alien exiles, and the disgraced draconic dissidents hiding among them that they had survived the toxic smog, the syndicate wars, and the crushing poverty of Sector 4. They were the hardened steel forged in the Empire's forgotten furnace. He declared that today. They were done running. They were going to take the fight directly to the man who thought he owned the sky. The silence in the drift broke. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the cavern, quickly building into a deafening, defiant roar. Mechanics slammed heavy wrenches against steel bulkheads. Smugglers powered up their illegal weaponry. Even the cynical black marketeers emerged from their stalls, clutching military-grade disruptors. Kalen had tapped into decades of simmering resentment, turning absolute terror into a highly focused, weaponized rage. Valia watched the human smuggler orchestrate a rebellion in less than 3 minutes. Profoundly awed by his sheer force of will, she stepped up beside him, the ruler of 1 trillion souls standing shoulder to shoulder with a common criminal. She asked him exactly how he planned to fight an entire blockading fleet with scavenged mining tools. Kalen grinned, a dangerous, reckless expression that sent a jolt of pure adrenaline straight through her chest. He tapped a few keys on the console, bringing up a schematic of his personal freighter, the Stardust Vagrant, currently hidden in a concealed auxiliary bay. It looked like a flying scrap heap, a bulky, asymmetrical mess of mismatched plating and oversized thrusters. But the schematic highlighted a highly experimental, deeply illegal military-grade cloaking generator Kalen had stolen from an Imperial dry dock 3 years prior. He laid out the gambit. It was a plan so entirely suicidal and tactically absurd that draconic military algorithms would completely fail to predict it. They were not going to fight the blockade, and they were not going to run for the outer rim. They were going to pack the vagrant with every explosive charge they could find, activate the experimental cloak, and fly straight up the planetary gravity well, directly into the belly of the beast. Their target was the Oblivion. High Minister Vane's personal command dreadnought, currently holding geostationary orbit directly above the capital. Kalen planned to bypass the dreadnought's exterior sensor net by using the heavy atmospheric exhaust vents of the lower city to mask their thermal signature. Once they broke atmosphere, they would execute a physical high-speed boarding maneuver, crashing the vagrant directly into the dreadnought's blind spot. Silas analyzed the tactical display, his hardened face paling. He pointed out that even if they miraculously breached the dreadnought's armor without being vaporized by point defense cannons, they would be trapped on a hostile warship surrounded by 10,000 elite loyalist troops. Kalen nodded, entirely unfazed. He explained that they did not need to defeat the entire army. They just needed to reach the central transmission spire located at the apex of the dreadnought. It was the only communications array powerful enough to override Vane's planetary blackout and broadcast a raw, unencrypted signal directly to the rest of the armada. If they could plug Valia into that console, she could show the entire draconic military that she was alive, expose Vane's treason, and strip him of his unearned command. It was a razor-thin margin for success, relying heavily on blind luck, untested technology, and an astronomical amount of violence. But as the countdown timer ticked past the 45-minute mark, it was the only option they had left. The alternative was waiting to be buried alive. Valia placed her hand over Kalen's on the console, her obsidian scales contrasting sharply with his pale skin. She gave him a firm, decisive nod. The Empress of the Draconic Empire officially sanctioned a pirate boarding action against her own flagship. The drift erupted into frantic, hyper-coordinated activity. Corbo and his team of mechanics sprinted for the auxiliary bay, ripping heavy plating from derelict ships to weld extra armor onto the vagrant. Rhea began compiling a massive, highly aggressive data spike program designed to slice through the dreadnought's internal security bulkheads once they were aboard. Silas requisitioned every piece of heavy weaponry the local black market had to offer, arming himself with enough plasma ordnance to level a small city block. Kalen pulled Valia aside as the final preparations fell into place. The air between them crackled with the heavy, unspoken reality of what they were about to attempt. The chances of them surviving the ascent, let alone the breach, were statistically negligible. He handed her a compact, high-yield human kinetic pistol, showing her the archaic but brutally effective safety mechanism. He told her that if the cloaking generator failed during the ascent, they would have roughly 3 seconds before the dreadnought's defense grid turned them into scattered atoms. Valia took the weapon, feeling the heavy, cold weight of human engineering in her grip. She looked up at Kalen, the massive exhaust turbines of the vagrant beginning to roar to life behind him, shaking the cavern walls. She realized that the intricate web of deceit Vane had woven was about to collide violently with the sheer, unpredictable chaos of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. But a deeper, far more terrifying question lingered as they strapped into the battered cockpit seats. If Vane's internal spies had successfully tracked Kalen's blood once, what was waiting for them when they finally cracked open the armored shell of the Oblivion? Gravity is a tyrant, but an overloaded plasma thruster strapped to a flying scrap heap is a remarkably effective rebellion. The stardust vagrant shot out of the subterranean exhaust shaft like a bullet from a rusted barrel, riding a massive pillar of superheated industrial smog straight into the upper atmosphere. Kalen wrestled with the primary flight yoke, his knuckles white, fighting the atmospheric turbulence that threatened to tear the hastily welded armor plating right off the hull. Beside him, Empress Valia watched the digital altimeter rapidly climbing, her obsidian scales reflecting the strobing warning lights of the cramped cockpit. The experimental cloaking generator shrieked in protest, a high-pitched, tooth-aching whine that promised imminent catastrophic failure. Ahead of them, hanging against the cold vacuum of space, was the Oblivion. It was a terrifying testament to draconic military supremacy. A wedge of black armor miles long, bristling with point defense turrets and heavy siege cannons. It was currently blockading the entire hemisphere. Completely blind to the tiny cloaked freighter riding the thermal updraft directly toward its underside, Kalen bypassed the automated targeting grids by killing the main drives entirely, letting momentum carry them through a dense field of discarded orbital satellites and frozen coolant ice. It was a blind, silent drift in the dark. They drifted dangerously close to the dreadnought's heavy armor plating. Kalen aimed for a specific microscopic flaw in the ship's design, an auxiliary waste ejection port located directly behind the massive starboard engine housings. It was an unmonitored blind spot, a relic of an older hull design he had studied for smuggling runs. At the last possible second, he fired a violent burst of directional maneuvering thrusters. The Vagrant slammed brutally into the heavy exterior hull of the warship, magnetic docking clamps groaning as they bit deep into the thick metal. The impact threw everyone hard against their harnesses. Kalen did not wait for the structural integrity alarms to silence. He hit the manual release for the boarding ramp and grabbed his kinetic heavy repeater. Velia was right behind him, the crackling shock baton and the stolen human pistol gripped tightly in her hands. Commander Silas brought up the rear, hefting a rotary plasma cannon he had acquired from the Drift's black market. They breached the secondary airlock using Corbo's modified thermal charges, blowing the heavy steel doors inward on a massive wave of molten slag. They stepped into the pristine, brightly lit corridors of the Oblivion, instantly triggering the internal security net. Sirens blared, bathing the white walls in harsh crimson light. A squad of loyalist security troopers, clad in heavy white armor, rounded the corner with their rifles raised. The ensuing firefight was a masterpiece of lethal, cross-cultural synchronization. Kalen slid across the polished deck, his human kinetic weapon roaring, shattering the troopers' energy shields with sheer, blunt force trauma. The deafening percussion of his primitive ballistics forced the enemy into cover, creating the perfect tactical opening. Velia moved through that opening like a shadow. Centuries of aristocratic combat forms blended flawlessly with the brutal street brawling she had learned in Sector 4. She vaulted over a decorative bulkhead, her shock baton sweeping in a devastating arc that short-circuited two troopers simultaneously. Without missing a beat, she fired the kinetic pistol with her offhand, putting a heavy lead slug directly through a third trooper's targeting visor. She was terrifying, elegant, and entirely unstoppable. Silas provided a relentless wall of heavy plasma fire, locking down the corridor and vaporizing reinforcements as they attempted to flank their position. They pushed deeper into the ship, navigating a confusing maze of maintenance shafts and secondary access corridors. Guided entirely by Ria's slicing algorithm running on Kalen's wrist console, the algorithm hit a massive, multi-layered encryption wall at a primary security bulkhead just outside the central spire sector. The heavy blast doors slammed shut automatically, sealing the three of them inside a pressurized secondary airlock while the program furiously attempted to break the military-grade code. The sudden, suffocating silence of the airlock was a jarring contrast to the ringing gunfire. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, burnt wiring, and adrenaline. Kalen leaned heavily against the steel door, his chest heaving. A fresh scorch mark burned across his armored vest. Velia stood beside him, her crown long gone, her majestic scales dusty and scratched. She looked at the smuggler, realizing they were standing in the heart of the most heavily fortified warship in the known universe, and the only thing keeping her alive was his sheer, stubborn refusal to die. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a streak of black soot from her cheek. The gesture was incredibly intimate, stripping away the artificial titles of Empress and criminal, leaving only a man and a woman standing on the absolute edge of oblivion. Kalen admitted in a low voice that if the slicing program failed, they had roughly 2 minutes before Vane's heavy assault teams flooded the airlock with weaponized neurotoxin. Valia did not flinch. She leaned into his touch, her golden eyes locking onto his with unwavering certainty. She told him that she had spent her entire eternal life sitting on a velvet throne, completely dead to the universe, insulated from the real struggles of her people. She confessed she had only truly started living the moment a rogue human bled on her in a dirty courtyard. It was a profound, quiet confession, the forging of a bond that transcended species, politics, and the overwhelming probability of their imminent deaths. They had found something genuine in the dark, a connection built on mutual respect and shared survival, and neither of them intended to let it go easily. The wrist console chimed a sharp, cheerful note that shattered the quiet moment. The heavy blast doors hissed loudly, the massive locking mechanisms disengaging with a heavy, metallic clunk. The doors parted, sliding back into the bulkheads to reveal the towering, cavernous antechamber of the central broadcasting spire. The room was a massive dome of reinforced glass and glowing server towers, looking out over the magnificent curvature of the planet below. But the antechamber was not empty. High Minister Vane was not a fool who left his most critical vulnerability unguarded. Standing in a perfect defensive line between them and the central broadcast console was the Praetorian Guard. They were 12 towering, genetically enhanced super soldiers encased in impenetrable dreadnought-class power armor. They wielded heavy energy halberds that could effortlessly slice a transport ship in half, as the Praetorians activated their weapons simultaneously, filling the massive room with a blinding, lethal hum. Valia tightened her grip on her weapons. She knew perfectly well that mere street tactics and kinetic bullets would simply bounce off this walking wall of absolute destruction, leaving them trapped in the belly of the beast. The grand antechamber of the Oblivion was built to project the absolute, unquestioned will of the Emperor. But today it would broadcast the violent collapse of an entire worldview. 12 towering titans of impenetrable armor stood between a dying empire and the bloody, desperate truth. High Minister Vane stepped out from behind the imposing wall of his Praetorian Guard. He was clad in a sleek, ceremonial combat exoskeleton that hummed with immense, stolen power. He looked at Valia not with fear, but with the weary annoyance of an aristocrat dealing with a stubborn ghost. He mocked her ragtag strike team, pointing out that bringing a human scavenger and a disgraced commander to claim a dreadnought was the punchline to a very dark joke. He raised his hand, signaling the immediate execution of the intruders. Valia did not waste breath on a debate. She knew exactly what kind of monster she was facing, and centuries of polite diplomacy had died in the toxic slums of Sector 4. She simply raised the human kinetic pistol Kalen had given her, taking a perfectly balanced combat stance, her golden eyes burning with righteous fury. Silas initiated the violence. He leveled the stolen rotary plasma cannon and unleashed a blinding, sustained torrent of blue fire directly into the center of the Praetorian formation. The sheer kinetic force of the heavy weapon pushed the giants back a fraction of an inch, their energy shields flaring brilliantly under the localized sun he was projecting. That microscopic opening was all Kalen needed. He dove past the shimmering energy fields, sliding across the polished obsidian deck toward the massive, glowing console of the central transmission spire. Vane snarled an order, and the pristine antechamber instantly descended into utter apocalyptic chaos. 2 Praetorians broke formation, their heavy halberds swinging in devastating wide arcs designed to cleave through heavily armored assault vehicles. Valia intercepted them with a speed that entirely defied draconic biology. The ancient human nanites coursing through her bloodstream had not merely eradicated the phage, They had hyper-optimized her cellular regeneration and kinetic response times. She was no longer just a royal martial artist. She was an apex predator operating on a completely different biological frequency. She ducked under a crackling energy blade, the radiant heat singeing the tips of her horns. With terrifying fluidity, she stepped into the guard of the first giant, driving the barrel of her kinetic pistol into the microscopic gap beneath his armored breastplate. The heavy human slug tore through the internal circuitry of the suit, dropping the massive soldier to his knees. She used his falling bulk as a springboard, launching herself high into the air, completely bypassing the second Praetorian and landing directly in front of High Minister Vane. Vane engaged his exoskeleton, throwing a punch that could shatter a starfighter canopy. Valia met his strike perfectly. Their forearms collided with a shockwave that rippled the air itself. Vane's eyes widened in genuine shock as he realized the Empress possessed a physical strength that vastly eclipsed his mechanical augmentations. Meanwhile, Kalen was fighting his own desperate, agonizing battle at the console. He frantically connected his wrist link to the main data port, initiating Rhea's aggressive slicing algorithm. A third Praetorian, having bypassed Silas's suppressing fire, charged the smuggler. Kalen drew his heavy repeater and fired point-blank into the giant's visor. The kinetic rounds sparked and deflected harmlessly off the thick armor. The Praetorian backhanded Kalen with the massive shaft of his halberd. The impact lifted the human entirely off his feet, sending him crashing violently into a bank of glass server towers. Ribs fractured with a sickening snap. Shards of reinforced glass tore through his armored vest. Kalen collapsed to the deck, his vision swimming in a sea of red agony. The giant raised his energy blade for the execution strike. A concentrated blast of superheated plasma took the Praetorian directly in the shoulder, spinning him around. Silas had abandoned his cover, marching forward into the open, roaring a battle cry as he focused entirely on keeping the human alive, willingly drawing the fire of 3 remaining guards. Kalen spat a mouthful of blood onto the polished floor. He dragged himself back to the console, his fingers slick and trembling. He ignored the screaming pain in his chest and focused on the glowing holographic interface. The Dreadnought's final firewall was a labyrinth of military encryption. But human chaotic ingenuity was a virus it had never been trained to fight. Vane and Valia were a blur of lethal motion. The High Minister fought with the desperate ferocity of a cornered tyrant, unleashing a hidden plasma caster from his wrist armor. He fired at point-blank range. Valia twisted, the blast grazing her side, burning away a patch of her obsidian scales. But instead of the terrifying gray rot of the phage taking hold, the wound instantly began to knit shut, silver blood sealing the burn in seconds as the nanites repaired the tissue. Vane stumbled back, utterly horrified by the impossible biology unfolding before him. Valia did not give him a chance to recover. She delivered a devastating, perfectly executed roundhouse kick to his knee, shattering the mechanical joint of his exoskeleton. As Vane dropped, she stepped in close, grabbing him by the armored collar and hoisting him upward with one hand, her claws digging deep into the metal. At the console, Kalen watched the progress bar hit 100%. The firewall shattered. He had complete unrestricted access to the master transmission relay of the entire Draconic Armada. Thousands of capital ships, orbital platforms, and ground garrisons were now slave to this single console. His hand hovered over the final manual override switch. His vision was fading rapidly, the severe blood loss taking a heavy toll. He looked across the room, locking eyes with Valia as she held the architect of her murder by the throat. Kalen flashed her a weak, blood-stained grin, a silent testament to the absurd, beautiful bond they had forged in the dark. He slammed his palm onto the master transmit relay. The massive screens encircling the antechamber flared from tactical blue to a blinding, brilliant crimson. The live feed activated. Across the entire galaxy, on every viewing screen, tactical visor, and public holovision. The planetary blackout ended instantly. Trillions of draconic citizens and soldiers were suddenly looking directly into the broadcast spire of the oblivion. They expected to see the stoic, mourning face of their new supreme commander announcing his grim war. Instead, they saw their supposedly dead Empress. Her scales scored with battle damage but glowing with vibrant, impossible life. She was holding High Minister Vane in a posture of absolute, undeniable defeat. Behind her, the ruined bodies of the elite Praetorian Guard littered the floor, and a heavily bleeding human was slumped over the master control console. Valia spoke, and her voice carried the weight of 1,000,000,000 souls, amplified across the stars. She did not speak with the cold, detached arithmetic of a sovereign. She spoke with the burning, furious passion of a survivor who had walked through the Undercity. She held Vane up to the camera. She explicitly detailed the genesis of the biological weapon, playing a brief, undeniable snippet of the intercepted logs. She exposed his grand design to murder her and initiate a preemptive galactic war against the Volari and the Sylphid. She stripped bare the arrogant lie of the coup, exposing the minister as a coward who engineered a plague because he lacked the courage to challenge the throne openly. Then, Valia delivered the final world-shattering truth. She looked directly into the lens and told her empire that their infallible genetic superiority was a myth. She announced that the pinnacle of draconic biology had failed, utterly defeated by a microscopic synthetic virus. She gently gestured toward Kalen, the exhausted, broken smuggler bleeding on her flagship's deck. She declared that the Empress of the galaxy was alive solely because a human from the lowest, most despised tier of the Undercity had shared his blood to heal her. She formally proclaimed that the age of draconic isolationism, the brutal subjugation of the lower tiers, and the arrogant delusion of genetic purity was officially over. She ordered the Armada to stand down its weapons immediately, to arrest any loyalist officers aligned with Vane, and to await further instructions from the true Ruby Throne. The transmission cut out, leaving the antechamber in sudden, ringing silence. Valia dropped Vane to the floor in disgust, her chest heaving as she turned and ran straight toward Kalen. The truth was out there, echoing in the void. But the immediate survival of the Empire now rested entirely on how a heavily armed armada would react to the complete destruction of their entire reality, and whether the human who saved them all would live to see the dawn. The silence that followed the greatest broadcast in galactic history lasted exactly 4 seconds before the stars themselves decided to change sides. High Minister Vane lay broken on the deck of his own command center, his mechanical augmentation sparking, watching his grandly engineered reality shatter across 1,000 holographic tactical monitors. The Draconic Armada was a military force programmed from birth for absolute, unquestioning loyalty to the Ruby Throne. As millions of soldiers and ship captains processed the indisputable visual evidence of their living Empress, the response was terrifyingly swift. Across the orbital grid, the massive plasma batteries of 1,000 heavy cruisers simultaneously powered down their targeting locks on the human enclave in Sector 4. With silent, terrifying precision, the entire fleet pivoted 180 degrees. They locked their devastating siege weapons directly onto the Oblivion and the handful of loyalist escort frigates that had supported Vane's treason. The grand coup did not end in a drawn-out, bloody civil war. It collapsed in a matter of minutes under the crushing, undeniable weight of its own exposed lies. Commander Silas stood over the defeated minister, the stolen rotary cannon in his hands still venting heat, and formally placed Vane under arrest for high treason against the crown. He effectively secured the flagship without having to fire another shot. As Vane's surviving bridge crew immediately dropped their weapons and surrendered, but Empress Valia was not watching the tactical monitors or her captured enemy. She was on her knees beside Kalen. The human smuggler had stopped moving. His breathing dangerously shallow as a pool of crimson blood expanded across the pristine obsidian floor of the antechamber. Valia pressed her bare hands against his chest, feeling the terrifyingly fragile beat of his human heart, and screamed for Imperial medics with a raw, unhinged desperation that completely terrified the surviving Loyalist guards. Far below the surface, in the damp, neon-lit caverns of the Drift, Corbo, Rhea, and thousands of outcasts watched the broadcast on a hijacked commercial screen. When the massive red countdown timer hovering above their settlement suddenly vanished, replaced by a planetary broadcast of Valia's decree, the subterranean city erupted. The sheer elation was deafening. Mechanics threw their heavy wrenches into the air. Black marketeers openly shared their hoarded synthetic liquor, and enemies embraced in the streets. They had stared directly into the barrel of an orbital bombardment, and their cynical, heavily armed scavenger had somehow flown into the sky and stolen the entire empire for them. 3 days later, the Grand Galactic Summit reconvened on Draconis Prime, but the atmosphere within the glittering palace was fundamentally altered. Empress Valia walked into the vast throne room, but she did not ascend the towering obsidian steps to take her seat upon the velvet cushions of the ruby throne. Instead, she had a simple, unadorned iron council table brought directly down to the main floor. She stood at eye level with the ambassadors, the senators, and the terrified aristocratic old guard. She wore her battle-scarred armor, the scorch marks proudly displayed, refusing the ceremonial silks that had defined her previous, isolated life. Her first royal decree tore the ancient foundational laws of the empire down to the bedrock. Valia officially abolished the rigid tier system that had kept trillions of citizens trapped in squalor. She explicitly pardoned the human enclave, allocating massive imperial resources to rebuild the toxic depths of Sector 4 into a habitable, thriving, and fully recognized district. Most shockingly to the assembled nobles, she formally recognized humanity not as a primitive, subjugated labor force, but as absolute equals. She cited their undeniable biological resilience and their chaotic, brilliant ingenuity as vital assets to the future survival of the galaxy. The old, stagnant empire was entirely dead, and Valia was forcefully dragging her people into a new era of aggressive unity. Whether the surviving traditionalists liked it or not, deep within the highly restricted Royal Medical Wing, bathed in the soft, restorative glow of a dermal regeneration field, Kalen finally opened his eyes. He groaned loudly, fully expecting the damp chill of a lower-level prison cell or the harsh, flickering neon of a black market clinic. Instead, he found himself resting on remarkably soft, temperature-controlled synthetics, surrounded by the quiet, efficient hum of the most advanced medical technology in the known universe. He tried to sit up, his mended ribs protesting sharply, but a gentle, remarkably strong hand pressed against his uninjured shoulder, guiding him back down to the mattress. Empress Valia sat perfectly still beside his recovery bed. She had completely bypassed every single layer of stringent royal protocol, dismissing her elite personal guard and the horrified medical droids just to sit alone with a human smuggler. She looked at him, a genuine, radiant smile breaking through her usual stoic mask, entirely transforming her face. Kalen offered a weak, crooked grin, casually remarking that Imperial hospitality had significantly improved since his last mandatory stay in the subterranean detention blocks. Valia laughed, a bright, clear sound that felt completely new to her. She told him that his impounded freighter, the Stardust Vagrant, had been fully repaired, upgraded with experimental Imperial stealth shielding, and officially registered as a sovereign royal corsair. She explained that his crew in the Drift were currently celebrating their newfound freedom with an absurd, highly dangerous amount of expensive liquor, entirely funded by the royal treasury. Kalen nodded, deeply relieved that his found family was safe. but he noticed a profound hesitation in her golden eyes, a quiet, lingering vulnerability she had only ever shown him in the dark aqueducts. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a soft, intimate register. Valia confessed that while she had successfully reclaimed her empire and stopped a galactic war, the prospect of ruling it alone from a high pedestal was suddenly unbearable. She told him she did not want a subservient subject, and she certainly did not want a traditional, politically motivated royal consort. She needed a partner. She needed someone who saw the universe from the bottom up. Someone who possessed the cynical, highly effective survival instincts to keep her honest when the aristocratic sycophants inevitably tried to rebuild their gilded cages around her. She offered him a permanent place by her side, proposing an unprecedented union of human grit and draconic majesty. Kaelin looked at the woman who had fought beside him in the slums, taken a bullet for him, and actively torn down her own armada for a truth she believed in. He realized he was entirely done running. The lawless, lonely frontiers of the Outer Rim suddenly seemed far less interesting than the massive, chaotic task of rebuilding a fundamentally broken galaxy alongside the most terrifying, beautiful warrior he had ever met. He reached out, his scarred hand intertwining with her flawless obsidian claws, and accepted the offer without a second thought. It was a partnership that would fundamentally terrify the rival Volari and Sylphid empires for centuries to come, as they now faced a superpower guided by ancient honor and fueled by unpredictable human audacity. Months later, the Stardust Vagrant launched from the central palace spire, its massive engines burning bright blue against the night sky. It did not fly alone. It moved in perfect, synchronized formation with an escort of heavily armed draconic dreadnoughts and sleek human interceptors. It was a chaotic, mismatched fleet, a perfect, beautiful representation of the new dawn breaking over Draconis Prime. They were no longer an isolated, arrogant superpower waiting to decay from the inside out. They were a united, fiercely resilient alliance, entirely ready to face whatever hostile forces lurked in the deep black, armed with ancient human nanites and the unbreakable will of a completely transformed Empress. Thank you so much for watching this story unfold. If you enjoyed this journey into the neon depths and the highest reaches of the Draconic Empire, please hit that subscribe button and share the video with your fellow sci-fi fans. Leave a comment down below with the word nanites to let me know you made it to the very end of the adventure. And do not forget to smash that hype button so this video can reach more viewers like you, helping us build an even bigger universe together.